Hello again. Bit of a clickbaity kind of title, perhaps. Bit controversial thing to say. Yeah. Druidry or Druidism is elitist. So, yeah, why? Why am I saying this? Well, I think you can take that in two parts. One, there's the original Druidry or Druidism, and there's modern day and revival Druidry. So I suppose I should start with the past. Well, that's pretty much an easy one to nail, because if you take the best examples, which really come from Ireland, the most documented, you can see that you had a very hierarchical society. You had a sort of caste system, somewhat similar to what still exists in India today with the Hindu culture. So at the bottom you have various classes of slaves, unfree people, and at the top you have the king, I suppose the high king, and then you have the regional provincial kings and sub-kings, and each of them having different castes of Druid, and the High King having the Chief Druid or Alav, which is obviously the highest status. Now, the only people who could speak in advance of the Ardri or other kings were the Druids, the top Druids. So you can see straight away you have a very elitist, hierarchical society where the Druids are at the very top. The Druids didn't have jobs. Being a Druid was your job. So, and you relied on the patronage of your, whoever your client was. So, say you're a Druid for a sort of a provincial king, you would know the genealogy of that king, his family history, and stories and poems, etc. about the king's family. You would probably write poems about the king. You'd write satires against his enemies. You might perform some magical acts against his enemies as well. You might do prophesizing, you might be a physician and healer for the king's family, etc., etc. You would probably act in cases of conflicts as an adjudicator and sort of a minister of justice, if you like. But obviously, in order to do this, you have to be very highly educated, and sort of a minimum period, according to most historical sources, about 12 years, up to 19, 20 years for sort of the top guys, and women, of course. You should remember that women also were allowed to be Druids, which is somewhat different from some other cultures where only men were allowed to be sort of members of the priesthood. Women were also allowed to own their own property, and they had pretty much equal rights in ancient Ireland with men, which seems quite progressive when you compare it with many other societies of the time. For instance, in Rome, the wife and children of a Roman citizen were actually his legal property. So you can imagine, how horrible that must have felt to be actual property of somebody else. You wouldn't even have to be a slave; you just have to be a member, a less important member of a family. So if a wife or child, and you belong to the man of the house, So anyway, I've digressed a little bit, but there you see, straight away you can see the elitist nature of Druidism that you would have to be educated and receive the patronage of somebody wealthy in order to actually undergo all this training, because how are you going to feed yourself, look after yourself, unless you have money, or you come from a family with money, or you have the patronage of an important person who you've got to work for. How are you going to survive? So generally it wasn't the kind of thing you could just suddenly rock up and go, hey, I'm going to be a druid. It didn't work like that. People's stations in society were generally fairly fixed. In Ireland, you could earn your way out of being a slave eventually. But it wasn't exactly a wonderful life. And people could quite clearly see what class you were in from the colours that you wore. And Druids were, I think, the only class who were allowed to wear multicolours. Everyone else had their own particular colour, even royalty. So anyway, moving on from that, if you look at the Romantic Revival, which began in the early 1800s, if you look at these people who were involved, you've got people like John Aubrey and John Toland, William Stukeley, and others later on as well. All of these people were wealthy. They were highly educated. Many of them went to, very important universities like Cambridge and Glasgow University, Oxford, etc. So, bearing in mind the average person in Ireland or Britain or in France would have been struggling just to get by. They'd have been too poor to concern themselves with such things as studying history or archaeology or herbalism, or learning to become a druid, or what would be they'd consider to be equivalent skills to the ancient druids. They'd be too busy trying to earn a basic living in order just to stay alive and feed their family. They wouldn't have time to think about such things. That would be considered utterly frivolous. Only the rich, only the wealthy could afford to indulge fantasies about the Druids and all the sort of romanticism. And you'll find a lot of the literature of the last 300 odd years, is written by people who had a lot of time on their hands, who were pretty well educated, had plenty of money, and they could sit around wistfully thinking about what being a druid meant, and flounce around in cloaks and, go exploring across the countryside, doing whatever they felt like, because they had the money to do it. So I'd say, the revival Druids were incredibly elitist, as much so as the original Druids would have been. I'm not saying this is a bad thing necessarily. Perhaps there is a place for people who are specialised in education, specialised in healing, etc., in justice. I mean, they're all separated in modern roles, but these kind of functions are perhaps not only necessary, but a benefit to society anyway. So perhaps we shouldn't look at it in terms of it being necessarily a bad thing. But of course, these kind of roles aren't available to everyone. If you don't have some means of paying for it, or if you don't have the sort of intellectual vigor that's required for these kind of roles, then you're not going to be able to do it. So just by their very nature, it is elitist, and it can't be anything other than that, really. So bringing this up to modern day, there's a lot of modern day pagans. Some of them might call themselves Druids, witches, shamans, but there's also just ordinary pagans. In order to be a pagan, you don't have to become a Druid and train to become a sort of pagan minister, like a sort of a high priestess, or a third degree Wiccan, or a shamanic practitioner. All these things are specific roles. To be a pagan, you can just be an ordinary run-of-the-mill pagan. You don't need to have titles. You don't have to do any of this stuff. And I'd say once again, to be a modern Druid is somewhat elitist. It tends to attract very middle-class people, very well-educated people, people that have quite a bit of money. Out of all the time I've had an interest in Druidry, Druidism, which is running back now, something around 30 years now. Of all the people I've met during that time who call themselves Druids or have been studying to be Druids, a very tiny minority, sort of maybe, somewhere between 1% and 5% of people I'd call working class, who are classed as sort of being, poor or financially disadvantaged. The vast majority of people who choose to go on this path are pretty well educated. They have money to spend on things like courses and, all the accoutrement that goes along with being a modern Druid for many people, Although, of course, in reality, to be a Druid, you don't really need to have a big staff. You don't need a cloak. You don't need a drum. All you need is this and this, your heart and your mind, and the will to actually kind of learn and try and explore and study and find like-minded people to learn from or work with. But again, I'd have to say the modern path, maybe not so much as romantic Druidism or the original Druidism. It's still elitist. It's maybe not as much so as it was. In fact, there are some organisations that try to make it easier for, say, people who are unemployed. They might give reduced rates to do courses. A good example of that would be the Order of Bards, Ovids and Druids, which I'm a member of. They actually do offer discounts for people who are financially disadvantaged, which is a good thing, because I'd like to see it being less elitist and there being more opportunities for everybody to follow this path that they want. I mean, so that, if you can't afford a €500 or £500 weekend away studying or whatever, it shouldn't have to be an impediment that prevents you from following this path. One good benefit, I suppose, today is that a lot of the literature that used to be incredibly expensive and still, hard copies of actual books can still be very expensive. You can get them online as PDF files, and you can also get, in many cases, cheap reprints off the internet. So, although it's still very much an elitist path by its very nature, and that it is geared towards sort of intellectualism, high level of education, high level of skills, and takes many years to become really proficient. I think the financial impediments are perhaps not as severe as they used to be, and I'd like to see that continue to improve, because I think it, it really should be a path that is available to anybody who has the capacity to do it. And the only restriction should be your own capacity in terms of your time, your energy, your intellect, and not your bank balance. But unfortunately, as is often the case with spirituality, money does seem to creep in there, and learning can be expensive depending on who you go to. So I'd say, yeah, if you're interested in being a druid, try to do as much as you can yourself. Be discerning about who you go to learn with, or who you spend your money with, and avail as much as you can of the free resources that you find on the internet. And the most important thing is perseverance and time, putting in the time and effort to learn and to study. That's all I have to say for now. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed that, please hit the like button and feel free to subscribe if you enjoy my channel. Thanks. Bye-bye.